It's about time that we address the massive callus-sized elephant in the room. Hot Toys collecting is dying. That's a fact. The question is not whether it's dying or not. The question is, can it be saved? And if so, how do we save it? But before we get started, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell. So that way you're notified when content goes live here. That said, let's figure out whether we can rejuvenate our dying hobby or whether it's time we pull the plug. Hot Toys collecting is shrinking. That's a very honest, obvious observation. Many longtime collectors are feeling the decline of the hobby, and there are very real reasons for it that we're going to go over today. Here's the clearest, most honest breakdown of why Hot Toys, long considered the highest quality company in all of collecting, is on a downward trajectory and what we can do about it. The first reason is that the movie market kind of sucks. It's obvious, but I feel like I need to say that this is no fault of Hot Toys or any other 1/6 scale manufacturer. And in many cases, just to be clear, when I talk about Hot Toys collecting, I'm also referring to other premium 6 scale brands such as InArt, J&D, and some third-party companies. Hot Toys has become synonymous with 6 scale collecting. So when I talk about them and other companies, a lot of times I'll just say Hot Toys collecting or Hot Toys just because that is the brand that is most recognizable. Do want to throw that out there just because. The movie market is honestly no fault of Hot Toys, but when you look at the highest 20 grossing films of the last 4 to 5 years, there's really not a lot of properties in there where you would say, man, there's a lot of great figures that could be made. Of course, there's some Marvel movies in there and some other films that have big budget superhero properties to them, but a lot of the films just don't really make for toyetic figures, or if they do, the fans of those properties are just not really interested in paying premium prices for 6 scale offerings. So when you had Marvel in its heyday, in its prime, with movies like Avengers Infinity War and Endgame, and even the first 2 Avengers films, and yet Star Wars, when they were super hot because of The Mandalorian, which became a cultural phenomenon, Hot Toys was producing a lot of relevant current offerings, but since then, the relevant current offerings are just not in a capacity to be made because the demand isn't there for them. So instead, we're getting a lot of nostalgic releases, which are great, but it's not bringing in new collectors. So when you have a lack of influx of new collectors, new people participating in the hobby, you don't have a supply of readily available new customers. You only have a supply of established customers who may move on from collecting for one reason or another. And it doesn't feel like anything fresh or new is really being delivered that frequent. And this is not Hot Toys or any other manufacturer's fault. This is the movie industry's fault. This is Hollywood for a lack of imagination. There are not a lot of properties that are getting people to the theaters en masse. There are no big tentpole cultural phenomenon films like Avengers Endgame anymore. Those things just aren't existing. People would rather stay home and watch videos on streaming or just wait for movies to be on demand instead of going to the theater. Getting people to the theater is a very difficult proposition these days, and getting people excited to buy merchandise from films is almost even more difficult. I think the second reason is that prices have reached the breaking point for a lot of people. Augmenting what I said about my first point about established collectors being the primary audience of Hot Toys collectibles, you have collectors who are used to figures being about $180 to $220, and now every figure is $275 to $300 or $400 or $500. These figures are getting very expensive, and anytime I run polls, I see the collectors spend roughly $1,000 to $3,000 per year. If you're spending $1,000 per year, that's probably about 3 figures per year. Collectors are feeling like they're priced out and they're not feeling as in love with the offerings, and people just aren't buying near as much or engaging with the hobby near as much because of it. For a lot of collectors, it's gotten to a point where it's become increasingly difficult to justify the purchase of these figures due to rising prices. I mean, you got tariff fees now, you got shipping fees and tax. It really does add up after a while with rising prices due to inflation, and it becomes more difficult to buy them. I think for most collectors, space is an important factor, but price is probably the #1 biggest contributor to a waning interest in the hobby. Another reason is that there are just too many releases and people are kind of getting FOMO fatigue. This is a symptom of a poor movie market. Hot Toys has to make figures. They can't simply sit on their hands and make nothing. So in order to make quality offerings, they have to make repaints and reissues and endless 2.0s and 3.0s and variants of certain figures. These are the offerings that collectors are probably most likely to buy when there's not new, exciting, enticing offerings. that will bring in new collectors and excite old ones. And when this is the reality of the market, collectors feel overwhelmed and worn out and just numb to all the announcements. It's very difficult to keep up with Hot Toys, just them alone. You have InArt and J&D too, but Hot Toys is releasing and announcing 80 to 100 figures per year respectively. And that's very difficult to follow when you have mounting obligations in your life. Nothing starts to feel special after a while when they've seen the hype come and go for a million different offerings, and all these variants don't do as much for them. Another reason is that for many long-term collectors, these reissues destroy the feeling of rarity or having something collectible. Hot Toys collecting for many long-term collectibles has changed dramatically. These things used to sell out and aftermarket prices would often rise. But now that's typically not the case. Many figures can be found at or below retail price, and that makes these less collectible and more consumer purchases. When Hot Toys starts to feel more like consumerism than it does collecting, many of those long-term collectors start to feel like they're not buying something that's really all that valuable, that's worth the hard-earned money that they're spending. And that's a huge problem, because if that's the case, they're not going to dedicate those funds and make it a priority to actually collect these figures. In general, people are losing that sense of urgency to buy most figures. It doesn't feel all that special to many collectors anymore, and because of that, the aftermarket rates are not as good for most Hot Toys collectibles, and just the engagement overall with the hobbies just tends to decline. Put simply, a collectible that is no longer a collectible and more so veers into the territory of a product loses its appeal to many old school collectors. Another reason I believe is that competition has erupted, so the competitive landscape has changed. When I started collecting in 2017, 2018, Hot Toys was the undisputed king. They had no equal. They had no competition that could even come close to the level they were producing in terms of realism and accuracy. Now that's not necessarily the case. InArt Collectibles is the primary competition at this point, and while they're producing far less figures than Hot Toys on an annual basis, they are producing very high quality figures that are very much market competitive. In many cases, higher quality figures than most Hot Toy figure offerings, but depends on who you ask. You also have J&D, who has, to be fair, released one figure out into the world, but it is the highest quality 1/6 scale figure that I've ever had in my collection. And now you have third-party companies like Toys creating good stuff and Game Toys, and there's just a lot of good stuff out there, whereas before Hot Toys was the end-all be-all for 6 scale collecting realism, that's not the case now. Hot Toys is still the king, albeit not undisputed as they were prior. They're going to be the king as long as they have Star Wars and Marvel, which are the most sought after licenses and characters for collectors. So long as Hot Toys has those licenses and continues to produce very high quality figures, they're not going to be topped, but doesn't mean they don't have competition. And because of that competition, collectors are being more choosy about where they spend their money. Should they spend a little bit more to get an InArt or a J&D figure instead of buying a Hot Toys figure? Those are the legitimate questions collectors are asking themselves that they weren't asking themselves years ago. Another reason is that there is a decent amount of the collecting population that grew up and outgrew Hot Toys collecting, and the younger generation doesn't seem to care. I'm purely speculating, but I feel like the younger population these days, the Gen Z, I guess you would call them, they don't care as much about collectibles. They're more so into just having a good time, fashion, creating social media trends, and things along those lines more so than collecting high-end action figures. Hot Toys collecting doesn't seem to have the same appeal to a younger generation as it did to us when I was growing up in my early to mid-20s. And I'm not sure what the cultural reason for that is, but I think the impact is significant. For the collectors that outgrew the Hot Toys collecting hobby, there could be any number of reasons. A lot of time it's familial, there's family commitments, there's career commitments, or any sort of other commitment that maybe would take up time, energy, or funds, maybe having children that could really steer you away from Hot Toys collecting. This next idea kind of ties into my original thought where I said the movie market is getting worse. The Marvel and Star Wars pipeline got far worse. I mean, think about it. What has Star Wars released in recent years that is really all that figure worthy? I mean, I guess you could argue Andor season 1 and 2, but Andor has never reached the heights of, say, The Mandalorian. The Mandalorian was a cultural phenomenon. Baby Yoda, Grogu was everywhere. And what is Hot Toys making? They're making original trilogy characters and, of course, prequel trilogy characters. So they're making nostalgia-based classics instead of new offerings. And that's, again, not that enticing to newer collectors. I think there's just a general MCU and Star Wars fatigue, and these characters just don't seem to have the cultural impact like they did when things were super hot. When Avengers was hot and everyone was going to the theaters and everyone was going to see Spider-Verse, the numbers on those videos, on the review videos, were outstanding. They were incredible, even reaching the masses. But now that those films have just aren't part of the cultural phenomenon or the cultural discussion, that things have just really died down, and that causes collecting to not be as interesting or appealing. And of course, a lot of the Marvel MCU shows just really were very mid, and they started to water down the overall product, which caused people to lose interest and definitely not go spend money on merchandise like Hot Toys. Another observation of mine is that our community, which is primarily composed of mostly long-term collectors these days, is that the mindset has shifted from excitement to cynical. Anywhere you go on the internet, you will find dissenting opinions and contrarian takes, and every once in a while I'll have one of my own. I do understand somewhat of the logic considering you're paying high prices for them and they should be as high quality as possible, but in many cases, some of the critiques can be a little bit nitpicky. One stitch out of line, one button that's maybe slightly the wrong color, things like that cause other collectors to see that and say, it's limiting or reducing the amount of fun that I'm having with the hobby because all I'm doing is seeing people complain about it. This is a difficult line to draw in the sand because on one hand, I do agree that constructive criticism is very important. It helps Hot Toys make their offerings the best they can be and help you, the consumer/collector, get the most bang for your buck. At the same time, I do think we are here to enjoy the hobby first and foremost. And sometimes if you don't take a step back and just smell the roses, you forget why you're here in the first place. At the end of the day, I think it's important that we engage with this hobby as much as possible to have as much fun as possible within the constraints of our individual circumstances. All of us have different responsibilities and funds and the amount of time we can commit to this hobby, but I think it's important that we dedicate as much as we can to it to make it as good as possible for everyone that's here and everyone that will be here in the future. Guys, so let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Make sure to comment, let me know what you think about my thoughts and my theories, my speculative theories in this video, and let me know whether you think the Hot Toys collecting is dying or whether it's thriving in some way. Maybe it's somewhere in between, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts. I have my concerns. I'm still relatively optimistic because I'm an optimistic person, but I do think there are some serious concerns that I have about where the Hot Toys hobby has been headed and hopefully where it's going in the future. But I guess only time will tell. Guys, if you liked the video, make sure to click the like button down below, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell so that way you're notified when content goes live here. Check out my channel for other types of content. There's reviews, live streams, helpful guides, and of course, big picture videos like these. Tons of fun stuff that you'll want to check out. And let me know your thoughts on all of that. And of course, what other types of content you want to see. Guys, thank you so much for joining me as always. I will catch you in the next video. Peace out. See you later. Bye.